Hi, welcome to Religion for the Rest of Us, episode 7. Continuation of the comments. I think we can just pick up where I left off last time with comments on episode 4.
Okay, 12 ut 5, right? It's said that you need to separate faith from the practice of faith. Question. It says in the Bible that someone working on the Sabbath should be killed. If Christians and Jews, otherwise sane, decided they needed to follow that commandment in order to be good followers of their religion, would the problem be with the faith or just the practice of it? If the latter, why wouldn't there be anything wrong with the faith? And, although the Bible says that someone working on the Sabbath should be killed, don't we ignore that fact because of the civilizing influence on Jewish and Christian religions over the centuries? Not because there can't be said to be anything wrong in the text of these faiths. And if so, could it not be said that perhaps what we're seeing with Islam today is not that there's nothing wrong with the text of Islam, but that Islam has not undergone the same kind or degree of civilizing influences Judaism or Christianity have gone through as of yet? And if that's so, wouldn't it be detrimental to the peaceful evolution of Islam to not be critical of the religion, where warranted, so that Muslims will take seriously the need to change how their religion is interpreted and lived? Well, this is a huge, huge can of worms. So in Exodus 31, starting at verse 14, the Bible says, "Observe the Sabbath, because it is holy to you. Anyone who desecrates it must be put to death. Whoever does any work on that day must be cut off from his people. For 6 days, work is to be done, but on the seventh day is the Sabbath, holy to the Lord. Whoever does any work on the Sabbath must be put to death. The Israelites are to observe the Sabbath, celebrating it for generations to come as a lasting covenant. It will be a sign between me and the Israelites forever. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, and on the seventh day he abstained from work and rested." It does certainly say that an Israelite who breaks the Sabbath should be killed. Whether or not Israelites still exist today in the same way that they existed at that time is a question for debate. Certainly they're Israelis, but do we consider that to be a continuous group or a nation or a population? That's, like I said, it's open for debate. Within Judaism as well, there are some very tight controls put around how the death penalty is applied and what criteria has to be met in order for that punishment to be meted out. And this is primarily in the Talmud. I'm not going to get into that either. But there's legitimate theological reasons why Jews aren't just killing each other anytime another one of them breaks the Sabbath. It's also important to point out that even at the time, none of this was meant to apply to anybody but the Jews, but the Israelites. And the other thing to keep in mind is that it also explicitly says that this is a symbolic act. It is a sign of the covenant between God and his people. And that covenant has to do with the messianic promise. It goes all the way back to Adam and Eve. There's this rift, there's this fall from grace, and God says, okay, you've been cast out of the garden, but even though things aren't totally square with us right now, I promise that somebody will come, that out of this population, a promised one will come, and will heal the rift between God and man. So many of the Old Testament Jewish laws are designed to separate the Jewish people, the Israelites, from their surrounding neighbors, and from pretty much anybody else on the planet, because they have this special covenant with God, this religious obligation that means they need to set themselves apart in order to fulfill this covenant, because from their midst is going to be the appearance of a Messiah. It's not meant to apply to everyone. I want to read another passage as well, because that's the Jewish perspective. The Christian perspective also means we have to take into account things that Jesus said. So if we go to Mark 2, it says, starting at verse 23, "One Sabbath, Jesus was going through the grain fields, and his disciples walked along. They began to pick some heads of grain. The Pharisees said to him, 'Look, why are they doing this unlawful thing on the Sabbath?' And he answered, 'Have you never read what David did when he and his companions were hungry and in need? In the days of Abiathar, the high priest, he entered the house of God and ate the consecrated bread, which is lawful only for priests to eat. And he also gave some to his companions. Then he said to them, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath.' Another time he went into the synagogue, and a man with a shriveled hand was there. Some of them were looking for a reason to accuse Jesus, so they watched him closely to see if he would heal this man on the Sabbath. Jesus said to the man with the shriveled hand, 'Stand up in front of everyone.' Then Jesus asked them, 'Which is lawful on the Sabbath? To do good or to do evil? To save a life or to kill?' But they all remained silent. He looked around at them in anger and deeply distressed at their stubborn hearts, said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." He stretched it out, and his hand was completely restored. The Pharisees then went and began to plot with the Herodians about how they might kill Jesus. So, within the Christian tradition, yes, you have this Old Testament law laying down very, very strict regulations about breaking the Sabbath. And a penalty, yes, you should be killed. Then you have Jesus who comes along and says, wait a second, man was not made for the Sabbath was made for man, which can be understood as a general reinterpretation or deconstruction of the Old Testament law. It can be argued that Jesus' entire ministry was a deconstruction of the Old Testament laws. The law, as it's put down in the Old Testament, should not supersede the needs of doing human good. I think it gets down to, in a very pointed way, the problem with the fundamentalist interpretation of any religious text. Looking at it as though you can take out any piece of a particular text and think of it as a lever, or a recipe, or stereo instructions, where if you just follow it step by step, then you're doing what it says, and you're leading some kind of a righteous life. It's not doing justice to the text to ignore the vast complexity and internal contradictions of it. The contradictions themselves attempting to illustrate some greater level of complexity. There's something behind the contradiction. There's something in acknowledging both sides of something and recognizing that as human beings, we are often stuck in the middle. So I'm going to pull out, this is probably my favorite novel. It's called Brothers K. If you ever get to know me, I will probably end up giving it to you at some point. I'm pulling this out simply because David James Duncan, the author, has a section where he takes from the New Testament many very clear contradictions just to illustrate how, on the surface, inconsistent biblical text can be. So the first two are from Paul in his letter to the Galatians, chapter 6. Bear ye one another's burdens and so fulfill the law of Christ. And then also in that same chapter, for every man shall bear his own burden. And the rest of these are actually from Jesus, right out of the gospel. So in Mark 7 it says, honor thy father and mother. But then in Matthew 11 it says, and call no man your father upon the earth. Matthew 5 says, love thy neighbor as thyself. But then Matthew 8 says, let the dead bury their dead. In John 14, Jesus says, peace I leave with you, my peace I give unto you. But then in Matthew 10, he says, think not that I came to send peace. And in Mark 9, Lord, I believe, help thou my unbelief. The point I'm getting at, there's a reason that Jesus talked in parables and said things like the kingdom of heaven is like a mustard seed. You can't directly speak about something that is completely metaphysical. It's beyond the realm of human language to describe adequately. Using poetry and metaphoric language has often been the means at which people who are trying to describe the spiritual experience are pointing in that direction. Sometimes it is the contradictions within a text that actually point towards the impossibility of expressing exactly that which needs to be said, but cannot be said. Whether or not this is something that you understand immediately, intellectually, intuitively, however you get it, the important thing to take out of this is that the Torah, the Bible, the Quran, the Bhagavad Gita, any of these texts are immensely complicated. When you try to isolate individual verses and say, as Christian fundamentalists do, well, the Bible said it, I believe it, and that's that, you're not really doing justice to the text. And you're really reducing it to the lowest common denominator, especially if you're coming to it from a critical perspective. If you want to legitimately have a conversation about what's in a religious text, you have to respect its complexity. And you're not doing that if you isolate a single passage without recognizing that it exists within a richly textured and complex whole. Aside from that simplistic approach to textual analysis, there's something else I gotta bring up. And that's this question about the civilizing influences on Judaism and Christianity. I think we're bordering on racism here, if not stumbling completely into it. This notion of the civilized world versus the savage has been a justification for all sorts of horrors that white European and American populations have used to justify their oppression, subjugation, and colonization of people across the world for centuries. The notion that we're the civilized and we need to civilize the savages, to talk about the lack of a civilizing influence on an entire religion, which is a quarter of the world's population, is hugely problematic. You might want to think about what exactly you think those civilizing influences are. You also might want to consider that civilization, as a concept, comes from the word civis, which is the word for city, and cities developed as a result of the agricultural revolution. Once human beings had the ability to control their food supply via farming and the domestication of animals, they were able to settle in one place and build cities, which began in the Tigris and Euphrates Valley, in Iraq, in the heart of the Arab world. What we consider the Middle East, the Muslim part of the world, has been civilized, in the literal sense, far longer than anywhere else. It's where the birth of civilization happened. But even still, it's problematic to make this distinction between agricultural societies and hunter-gatherer societies. You're still putting these old racist categories onto the world's population. And the implication is that, well, we're civilized and we're also better. And if you're part of a hunter-gatherer society, you're less civilized. Couching it in these terms isn't going to get you anywhere. I should also note that there's some dialogue between Jay Wayne and 12@5 following this particular comment, in which 12@5 accuses Jay Wayne of being an ISIS. 12@5, I don't know where you're coming from here, but it doesn't look good. Regardless, I'm going to read another one of your comments. Here's a thought: if you say Sam Harris has no record of formal religious studies, scholarship, or education, and he therefore doesn't know what he's talking about whenever he talks about Islam or any religion, and that you also do not have such a record, how is it that you know or can say that Sam Harris doesn't know what he's talking about whenever he talks about Islam or any religion? So I was being a bit facetious here and just taking a poke at Sam Harris for using a logical fallacy, an appeal to authority or an appeal to accomplishment. In this case, an appeal to an accomplishment and authority that he doesn't actually have, but regardless, when somebody says, well, quite well educated on this subject, or well, I hold such and such degrees, or even if they give that credibility to somebody else, so-and-so said X, Y, and Z, and so-and-so is an expert in this field, and therefore we should listen to them. This is not a clean argument. It's not a valid way to make your case. And I think Sam Harris probably knows that. He was on Real Time. It's easy to slip up in that type of media environment. I get it. I was just sort of taking a shot at him because Ben Affleck had asked him a rhetorical question, and he came back with, well, I'm quite well educated. I'm sure he's read a lot of books. He doesn't have any formal education in comparative religion or theology. He considers himself to be quite well educated. I consider myself to be quite well educated. The point is not that either of us is better educated than the other. The point is that you can't make that your argument. Well, I'm actually quite well educated. It's not an argument, and we shouldn't accept it as one.
So that was episode 7 of Religion for the Rest of Us. You can see what a crazy editing space I've been in. I'm wearing a hat. My office is a mess. There's still more comments to get to, but I'm going to keep working through it. I think I can probably do it in 1 or 2 more episodes. Thanks for watching. Make sure you follow me, whatiremembered.com. Find us on Facebook. Just search for Religion for the Rest of Us. And don't forget to subscribe and share us on your preferred social media channel. Thanks, and I'll talk to you soon.